everyone, and welcome back to another Change the Air interview. My name is Kendra Seymour, and today I'm very excited to be talking with co-founder of Change the Air Foundation, Corey Levy. He's a second-generation indoor air quality expert and co-owner of WeInspect. And today we're going to be talking about how to go about developing a testing plan to find hidden mold in any building. So whether you rent or you own, you're going to want to save this episode. I promise you, there's going to be some great information. Corey, I'm just going to kick it over to you because I am so excited for the ins and outs and little bits of information that you're going to share with us. So if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kendra, for the introduction and for having me on and for being such a voice in a space that is needed. I'm so excited that I get to work alongside of you in this organization. And I'm really excited to be here today talking about this topic in particular, because I feel it's one that gets really lost in translation when we talk about mold testing, right? Particularly when it comes to hypersensitivity. Everyone thinks we can just go ahead and do an ERMI and all of our problems are solved.
Right.
And right. And unfortunately, if it were that easy, then it would be 1, 2, 3, but it's not that, right? It is fairly complex, and it is there is different scenarios and kind of almost a process here that we really need to be following to make sure that based off of where you are at in your journey as an individual that may be affected by mold, that you're working with the right person and company and developing the right plan to find hidden mold within the building so you can make those next step decisions on, do I stay? Do I go? What do I do with my stuff? How do I fix these problems, right? These are all the things that are circling around in our head. And I want to today really focus on how we're going to lay that out for everybody. So I'm going to share my screen here. I have some visuals that I think is going to be super helpful. And Kendra, if I veer off into a weird direction, just be like, Corey, we're talking about this over here. Just stop me. Okay.
I'll bring you back. It's all good.
Bring me back. Okay.
Well, I love this because so many times when you're in the middle of it, people are like, just tell me what's step 1, what's step 2, what's step 3, because there's so many pieces of information that you're trying to think about and organize. So this is going to streamline this process and hopefully make it a little clearer for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to put this into, can you see the slides here?
I can.
Okay, cool. I'm going to put this into presentation mode and tell me if you can still see that.
Absolutely. And for those listening, I believe we're going to find a way to share these slides with you all on our website and through our newsletter. So
yeah, we'll create a downloadable PDF, Kendra, so that people can download it. Obviously, they're going to want to save the episode and listen to us talk, but if they want the notes of the slides, we'll make sure that's available for them too. So before we get into the testing aspect of it, I'd like to just do a real quick overview of mold and biotoxins in the environment, because as you know, it's not just mold spores, it's not just that, right? And if you're not understanding the complexity of the organism, you're not going to understand the appropriate ways to test for it and how we develop those plans. So we're going to stay pretty focused on mold and bacteria in water damaged buildings, right? When we break these guys out into 2 kind of categories, they're going to be what you're going to be talking about from impact, right? How are we going to be affected by them? So mold really has these 3 components. They each have a purpose for mold. They've got spores, which are part of reproduction. This is what everybody thinks when they think of mold typically. I have mold spores in my house. It's bad. And yes, it is. These are actual little airborne particles that float around. And this can cause many times the allergenic reactions that we think about: sneezing, coughing, respiratory issues, sinus infections. It can affect our skin. But what people don't realize is it goes deeper than that. It can grow in our nasal passage. It can grow in our guts, right? And overall cause inflammation within the body. So understanding spores and how they're moving throughout the home is critical in this process. Now, the next phase of this are mycotoxins, and these are actual defense mechanisms. Okay, this is how mold protects where it's growing, because where it's growing is what it's eating. Its job is to break down that surface. Now, it's going to produce this chemical to protect that area, and this becomes airborne as well. What's the significance? Well, for some of us, we don't detox this stuff very well or at all. And so it builds up in the body over time. And then it can cause a variety of health issues. And these can be a bit more harder to pin down. A lot of times we hear things like brain fog or neurological implications, right? Even can run down the range of immunosuppressant disorders, right? So from a practitioner's perspective, sometimes it can be hard to really pinpoint that information. But when you hear somebody say toxic mold, or I've got black mold in my house, yes, there are the spores, the growth of it, but what is being produced that's causing it to be toxic are mycotoxins. Okay. And then you have MVOCs, microbial volatile organic compounds. We all know this stuff. We're in around it all the time. I like to refer to it as like the antique store smell.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, sorry for anybody who owns an antique
Grandma's
shop.
basement. Yeah.
Yeah, grandma's basement. Right. Yeah, exactly. This is digestion. Molds eat, right? And they will produce an odor. It's not always there, but sometimes it is. And usually we hear things of like headaches, scratchy eyes, burning throat, things like that. Now, all of these move through the home differently. And so there's different testing aspects for it. Then you've got another layer and component that I would say, and Kendra, check me on this, probably in the past 5 years has become more and more popular, and that's bacteria, right?
Yep.
Particularly when it comes to groupings of bacteria called actinomycetes, which are actually gram-positive biotoxin producing bacteria. So think of mold and mycotoxins, bacteria and biotoxins, right? And so these are derived from 3 different sources. Typically, it's soil, water activity, just like mold, or actually from us. And they can be in the environment and cause a lot of the similar health implications that mold and mycotoxins can. And then you have endotoxins, which are actually from gram-negative bacteria, and they're actually shed as bacteria die, right? And so these can cause a lot of that inflammatory response as well. So when we're looking at a home, a lot of times these are going to be located in the same areas from a contamination perspective. So if we're identifying where these improper moisture content areas are located, we're also locating where bacteria is, because mold and bacteria like to grow in similar locations. So now that we understand this, the boring part of it, the breakout, let's jump into how it actually moves through the home. This is going to be how either you as an individual is going to survey the land and try to figure out where things are, or if you're hiring a company to come out, if they're not taking these levels of the indoor environment into consideration, we're missing. And so mold and bacteria and biotoxins are going to be distributed throughout the property in the first level through what we normally think of when we see a vent, right? We can actually feel air moving. It's not like that is always necessarily clean air, but this is the top level. This is the ventilation systems, the air conditioning units. This can be a distribution highway for contaminants, right? Particularly if they're contaminated themselves. So you get them forced into the environment, and these environmental pathogens, whether they're growing in the system itself or it's sucking air in from a contaminated area and then distributing it around the home, need to be looked at to understand how contaminants are getting into our breathing zones. Okay. Now, the second level is middle tier, right? Or mid-level. And this is the structural components of the building. So there's a lot of times where mold is hidden, right? Inside of walls, behind and around windows, underneath flooring areas, right? Mold isn't what we see in the news. I've been in this industry, right? I mean, I've been in this industry for like almost 15 years now. And I was on the ground doing inspections, and I can count the amount of times that I've walked into somebody's house and just seen black mold crawling up the wall, right? Like it's not a very obvious thing. It's usually hidden, it's subtle, right? And so we have to understand that these are going to be within spaces when looking around, and this is where they're going to be coming out, because these aren't hermetically sealed walls that don't allow pressure change. So these contaminants can move through settlement cracks, electrical outlets, ceiling vents, right, where they can come into the general space. And then the final is the bottom level. This is how the contaminants get re-aerosolized. Okay, this, as the saying goes, what goes up must come down, right? So if we have contaminants that are being released into the air, spores, or you have toxin chemicals that are coming in the air, yes, they're going to float, but eventually they become part of our dust reservoirs. Okay. And so when we're hopping on this couch or we lift a book off that shelf over there, what are we doing? We're re aerosolizing what has settled out, and it becomes back into our breathing zone, ultimately getting back into our body. My colleague and business partner, Brian, uses this analogy all the time. For those of you that know the Peanuts characters, there's a character there, Pigpen, who used to have this dust cloud around him, and anywhere he went, he would have this filth, right? Well, all of us actually have that.
Yeah.
There's always aerosolation, right? And so if somebody were to monitor the air in this room when there's nobody sitting in it, and then we filled that room with people getting up and off the couch or shuffling around, the air quality is going to be completely different. So understanding how all of these levels of the environment come into play is ultimately going to be helping us get to our end goal of how do we fix the house, right? And testing gives us that answer to piggyback into what needs to be done. So let's kind of talk about the different ways that we're going to understand these three levels that are sandwiched together and why we test those things. So
I love that, because I'm going to tell you, I had 10 years ago a contractor tell me that mold behind the wall can't hurt me. Or, when people say, well, I'll just close the door to that room and it won't impact the rest of the house. And unfortunately, it's just not that easy.
it's not. And there's a crack at the end of the door.
Yeah.
I mean, we all see the crack.
Yeah.
So, things move, and we're talking about microscopic organisms that we can't even see with our naked eye, right?
Right.
And then what happens too is a lot of these events that cause the mold to grow there to begin with have already happened like years ago. So it's dry. What happens to things that dry? And they begin to whittle and fragment and become brittle, right? If you think of like a tree or a bouquet of flowers, if you stop watering the bouquet of flowers, it's not like you walk by that vase one day and the flowers are gone. No, they're still there, right? You have to throw the flowers away. And
Right.
when you move the flowers, they just make a mess and there's stuff flying all over the place. The same thing is happening with mold. So the surface that it's growing on, it becomes super dry, super brittle. So any pressure changes in the building, winds, anything, it can cause these spores to become aerosolized easier. And then as they aerosolize, these spores that normally maybe our nose could catch or our throat could catch are now pieces, even smaller, that get into our body a lot easier, right? So when we talk about movement from behind these spaces from older water damage, the finest hairline cracks these things can get through, the electrical outlets these things can get through, right? They're able to move through the building fairly easy. So shutting the door or saying that just because it's in there, nothing's going to impact you, unfortunately, is not the case. So I hope you kicked that person out of your house.
It did, but it took a while. Lessons learned. But we're here now, and that's why we're
here
talking
now.
about it. So you don't make those mistakes I did.
Exactly. So why are we sampling, right? If we can understand what to look for, then why do we even bother doing it? Visually, it should be enough, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case. We have to confirm sources, right? We have to confirm the contamination, because you have the guys that you just talked about who would come in right behind you and say, nah, can't get out of the wall. I've been in this business for 15, 20, 30 years. I've been a contractor forever. No way it's getting through the wall. Not true. So you have to confirm that there's a presence there, right? The second is to understand the dispersion from the contaminated area. So we talked about the movement of these particles into the general living space and how things settle out. So you may have a problem, let's say in your kitchen downstairs. It's not like the spore that gets leaves where the growth is floating in the air and then hits the kitchen threshold and says, "Oh, I'm a kitchen mold spore. I'm not supposed to go any further."
Mhm.
No, it's going to keep floating and go upstairs and land on a bookshelf or on our pillow, right? We need to understand how things are moving so we can set the appropriate cleaning strategy.
Right.
And that kind of brings us into the next point is understanding how to clean the home, right? How do you remove sources where the molds are growing? And also what the cleansing of the environment needs to be to get rid of those byproducts. Because it's not just about it's in this wall, let's get rid of it. We have to clean the home holistically. And then the final part is understanding exposure. I'm sure many of us listening to this now, um, are searching for a reason as to why we're feeling kind of crappy, right? Um, you may have been on a merry-go-round of doctors. Having that information to understand what you're being exposed to, and then finding the right people to work with to look at what you're being exposed to, and maybe start to tie dots for you is really important. And I know that Kendra, you've spoken with a number of medical practitioners on this exact subject, and they actually use this information to kind of treat too, right?
Mhm.
Understanding exposure may change treatment modalities.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there really is that connection between your house and your home, and it all ties together.
Yeah, yeah. So we understand how they work, what their components are. We understand how they move. We know why we're testing. Let's talk about how to test because it's not all created equal.
Mhm.
Okay. So I'm going to focus on the testing methodologies that we find to be useful. And each one of them has their own gray area, and
Mm.
each one of them is bad if you don't use it in the right way. I'm going to talk and be very focused on using it in the appropriate manner. Okay. So the first is identifying the sources, right? Where is it growing? And for that, you're going to use targeted air sampling and surface sampling. Targeted air doesn't mean that we walk into the center of that room that I was showing before and we just pop open an air sample in a room. Just because it's in a room in a house doesn't make it targeted,
Right. Right.
right? You need it to be within a space that you believe a mold problem exists in that level two, right? Where structurally we believe there's a problem, whether that be due to water damage or a historical event. A tube is literally stuck inside of a wall and air is drawn, and we're able to understand if there's a contamination within that space. Okay. Crazy study we did, Kendra, for an
I love
entire year.
studies.
Oh, you love studies. Okay,
I
good.
love the data. Show me the proof because I'm tired of the people saying, I'm just going to set up this air sample in the center of your room and we should be good to go.
Right. An entire year, we went around to all of the houses that we inspected and we took an air sample in the center of the room, no more than 6 feet away from a wall that we suspected a mold problem to be in. Took that air sample and then stuck a tube in a wall and did this targeted air sampling that I'm talking about. Over 60% of the time, the air sample in the center of that room said there was no issue in that room.
Oh my
Yet there
God.
was a mold problem in the wall of that same room. And that's because of what we're talking about, right? Time of day, frequent, what's going on within the room. Is there activity, right? So you can literally have a problem in a room. If you're taking an air sample improperly, you're not going to pick it up. So it has to be targeted. The second is just direct fungal examination. Is that mold on that wall,
Mhm.
right? You can do this with a swab. That's typically what's done. Tape also as well, if you can get a good lift off of it. Bulk sampling, I typically don't recommend in a particular case if you're going to disturb a lot, but if it's a piece of something that you could send in the lab, that's an option as well. Now, that's going to help find the mold. Then you have to understand how it's dispersing, like we talked about before. So you've got three for this, focusing on mold and bacteria. Okay, so ERMI, I use this term lightly, the word ERMI. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an ERMI sample. It's more the technology behind ERMI,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is qPCR. It's all over the news, right? So you've heard it with COVID. It's essentially how we understand the DNA fragments of certain mold species. We know about the pitfalls of ERMI, how the scoring system can be very difficult if you're not understanding that deviation that occurs. Kendra, I'm sure, is going to be doing a talk on ERMI at some point.
We are
um,
with Mark Levy.
yeah, perfect. So he's got a great last name, that guy. Um, so it's rather understanding the composition of what's going on within the home and really breaking that out, and having that data tells us the certain types of species that are moving throughout the house. So whereas the targeted air and the surface sampling is done under microscopy, a person looking underneath the microscope and counting spores to help us say there's a high enough concentration here that there's mold, this is actually telling us there's Stachybotrys chattarum here. There's Chatomium globulus, Aspergillus niger. The bad boys are in the home that are going to cause issues for certain individuals. Okay. The second are MVOC, so those odors we can actually test for them. They're airborne. We can test to see if those are there. Particularly, these are usually brought in when you have somebody who's sensitive to like chemicals or odors. And then actinobacteria or actinomycetes, these were the bacteria that we talked about as well. Is it throughout the home? Is it within the ventilation systems, the ductwork, the air handler units? What is settling throughout the environment? Okay. The final are the biotoxins, mycotoxins, and endotoxins collected in the same manner as ERMI and actinobacteria. This is all done through dust collection, DUST. And this again is going to be looking for those biotoxins. How are they moving throughout the home? Are they in the ventilation? Are they settling on surfaces? Okay.
This is
So
great because I know I've hired lots of IEPs over the years, and no one had ever explained to me that these different tests have different purposes and really need to be used strategically in order to get accurate data. Too often here's a few samples and you're done.
right. And now what I'm seeing, and this is really dangerous too, and there's a lot of people talking about it in the field. They're just coming in and ERMIing everything.
Right.
Right. So let's just really quickly break those two scenarios out. You have somebody who comes in and takes an air sample in the center of the room. We already talked about that 60% of the time it's going to say everything is fine. But what if it says there's a problem? What do? Gut the whole room?
Right.
No, you don't gut the whole room. It's somewhere in one of the walls, right? So you need to be targeted to set that appropriate plan. And then we also talked about ERMI being a dust collection. So you're screening kind of the home, or you're screening the ductwork, but it's not a tool to identify where the sources are, because remember that scenario of the kitchen mold spore that floats up to the bedroom. That doesn't mean that the Stachybotrys is in that bedroom, right? It could be somewhere else within the home. So each one of these tests has its own gray area. We have to look at this as if we were going to a doctor. If you went to a doctor with a broken arm and they say, okay, come with me, we're going to do a strep test real quick. We're going to figure out what's going on with that arm. You're like, what? Are you kidding me? I need an x-ray, right? So it's utilizing the tools properly, not just saying that we could find all the information out with one test type. It's a combination of things. And that's going to give you the puzzle pieces and the data that you need to make the right, accurate decisions.
That's great. I love that.
So let's jump into that then, right? Because, all right, if I'm a renter and I'm a homeowner, I'm going to have different goals. Or
Absolutely.
if I'm buying, right? So I want people to know that when you're looking to work with somebody, or if, in some of these scenarios, you don't need to hire somebody just yet, like you're still trying to figure things out, that there are options. in that process. And part of working with a company has to be somebody asking you questions on what your goals are. Or if you don't have that right access to that right company, then knowing what your goals are on your own. And so what we really took time to do is break this out in a way so that people understand this is what I need to be thinking of if I'm a renter, right? Typically, it boils down to three things. Do we want to stay? Do we want to leave? Or am I in litigation? Homeowner, same thing. Am I staying or am I leaving? If I'm buying or renting a house, how do I find a healthy place, right? And then if I need insurance coverage or I want to make insurance coverage or litigation, I'm in the litigation, we need to build a plan to maximize restitution, right? Coverage back in either scenario. So we'll start on renters. You'll see a little asterisk here as an optional. That's what these parentheses mean. Okay. So if you're looking to leave as a renter, there is really, to minimize the amount of investment into the building, you don't need to go full board if you're leaving. And your goal really is only to just prove there's a problem and try and get out of your place. So you can do an inspection that involves taking a few enough samples to then go back to your landlord or your management company and say, hey, look, I did some testing. There's this going on here. I want out, right? And that for a lot of people is enough. Now, the next layer to this is understanding, however, how those sources have impacted our stuff, right? Now, for some people that are really sensitive, the dispersion of the spores that we talked about and the biotoxins get into our belongings, right? And so then when we go and move them to a new home and we're hanging on the couch, we're noticing we're not feeling very well. We're feeling kind of crappy and all these things, right? So we want to understand if we should bring them or not. That's where you're going to employ the dispersion and the biotoxin, particularly if you're sensitive and you want to know what you can or can't bring with you. Now, if we're looking to stay, total different ballgame, right? You have to understand where the sources are. You have to know where all of them are, especially if you're hypersensitive and you're not and you're affected by these exposures. And you also want to know how it's moving through the home, because again, back to the contents, what are we keeping? What are we cleaning? The optionality is biotoxin here. Some people aren't diving deep into mycotoxins or endotoxins. Personally, if I'm a renter, I'm pushing people. If I'm working with a renter, we're pushing people to do everything to go back to the landlord with to say, hey, look, we have to show where the sources are, how it's impacting the home through dispersion, and hey, there are mycotoxins here, right? And they're in my body, maybe. And then the final is litigation. Now, I hate this part of the industry, but unfortunately, it's a nature, right? And if you're in a situation where you're in a home that is not safe and there needs to be restitution for what you're being exposed to, you need to be able to show where it is, how it's dispersing, and the toxic load in the environment. If you think of that cookie trail of events that you have to show to a judge, you have to be able to say it's in this wall. This is the type. Here's the air sample to prove it. This is the species of molds through that ERMI panel or MSQ PCR, right? Showing that it is Stachybotrys chicharum in the home. And then, oh, by the way, there's trichothecenes here. There's mycotoxins here, and it's in my body. I mean, if I'm a judge and I'm sitting here and somebody just showed me that whole trail, yeah, that there's the cause, the effect, all of it, right? And so you have to remember in these litigation cases, you need to be able to prove where these things are and how they could be impacting you. I will say, litigation is not an easy thing, particularly when you're a renter. Okay, it's financially draining. It's emotionally draining. I usually, here at We Inspect, we try and help people to move on from it, because a lot of times it's just dragged out over years. And instead of focusing energy and resource towards finding a new place and and um, and healing, it becomes a toxic situation and a battle that can elongate that process. So obviously, there's certain scenarios where it's necessary, but just an asterisk on the whole litigation thing. It's not an easy thing.
No, and we're going to have some resources, just general, obviously not legal advice, on the website that you can check out. I also think, and I'd be curious your thoughts for renters in particular, because of the shortcomings you alluded to and how IEPs or someone might inspect a home. You want to pay for the inspection yourself as opposed to having your landlord do it. And I realize that is a financial commitment, but generally speaking, you want to be the one who owns the data. And I know, Corey, you may have seen this, where landlords or the management company won't release the data to the individual because they didn't pay for it. It's not their property, it's not their data. And it can be difficult because we've gotten calls from people, well, they just set up the air test in the center of the room. And we know from this conversation and others that testing method and the way it was done wasn't the best. So when you can have control over the data and who you hire, I think it's gonna work to your advantage.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I've been in this situation, Kendra, where like we went to somebody's house and the renter called us, super sick. I need this done. No problem. Help you out. Landlord calls, hey, heard my tenant's sick. I don't think there's a problem here, but go on out. We'll pick up the bill. We go, we do all these different types of tests, hand the report over. And the renter calls, says, hey, I want the report. No problem. Can you get permission from the landlord? And the landlord's like, I'm not showing any of this to them. And we can't release it. We have a contract with them, right? The ball needs to remain in your court. You have to do that. Some workarounds here that I've advised clients, if they decide to go down this path, if it's a financial, it can be a financial burden for many, reach out to the landlord and say, hey, look, I think there's a problem here. I want to hire an inspector, a company of my choosing. I will pay for it. If they find a problem, I would like to be reimbursed. Here's the thing, guys, there's always a problem, right? So it's a little trick. The landlords don't think so, but there's always a problem. If you think there's a problem, it's in your gut, your body's telling you there's a problem, right? So that allows you to get the data, you get it in writing from them, and it can allow you to stay in the loop, right? Because ultimately, depending on what you get back, you may thought you wanted to stay, but now you want to leave, right? And if the landlord or the management company has a control of that data and they're not allowing you to have access to that, you may not know how severe that problem is, and you may not know what you're being exposed to, right? So it's I'm so glad you said that. It's very important to try and be the one moving this situation forward. So not all of us are renters. Some of us own a home. I myself own a home, and it's a whole thing, right, Kendra? Like you
don't want, that's a whole episode. We can talk about my house problems with multiple homes and all the areas. It's an ongoing project, right?
All right, yeah. And like I just bought a house a year ago and renovated it, and it's like you think, even being in the position that I'm in, I thought I found everything. You start opening things up, you find more things, right? And so when you're looking at this as a homeowner, you have to understand a few things. First off, you needed to really decide if you want to leave or if you want to stay. Okay. Knowing that no matter where you go, particularly if you're hypersensitive, you're going to need to do something. That's just the truth of it. No matter where you go, every home has something. Now, there's degrees of something, right? Some homes may have 7 problems. Some homes may have 25 problems. There is no issue with taking on a home that's a big project if you want to do that. Or if you want to be more strategic and try and find a place that has less problems, just know that you're going to need to do the work somewhere. And for some people, they are done with their home. They've outgrown it, right? They don't want to put the money towards it. If you're looking to sell your home, you don't want to do an inspection. You just don't want to do it, because if you ultimately find problems, what do you need to do, Kendra?
Disclose and fix it.
Disclose and
Yeah.
fix it, right? Now, this is a really messed up
Varies by
conversation to have.
state.
It does vary by state. Our boy Brandon is trying to make it so that it is a mandatory thing, because there are states that ultimately you don't have to. You could have
Right.
had a flood. And you don't have to tell anybody.
Yeah.
It's crazy. But for some, you do, and I would hope that most people should say something. I
Sure.
mean, maybe you and I are a bit more ethical, but at the end of the day, you should be disclosing, right? And so if you go through this very thorough assessment and find all of these problems, you now need to disclose that in some states to the incoming person, and you either are selling a lemon, or what is considered a lemon at this point of a house, um, or you have to invest in selling your house, which nobody ever wants to do that, right? Look, maybe aesthetically we redesign the kitchen or we do a bathroom, but a nice clean crawl space, nobody really cares
Yeah.
about that, right? So, you know, what you're really looking for at this point from a hypersensitivity perspective is just understanding what is here and what could I be bringing with me. So dispersion sampling, biotoxin sampling, what's in the dust. Now, if we're staying, it's the full gamut. And I usually try and push people towards staying, just saying this because particularly right now, it's super hard
Mm-hmm.
to find a home. And if you've been in a home, you know more about the house. You know the weird things. We
Mm-hmm.
talked about the consulting aspect that happens up front when somebody's trying to find out your goals when you're working with a company. You're just going to know things. Oh, yeah, my kid overflowed the bathroom that one time.
Right.
Or,
Right.
right? Or,
That
you know
history
what?
of them.
The history of the home,
Yeah.
right? You don't have that. You're inheriting somebody else's problem when you buy new. Or if you buy a brand new construction home, it's not like these guys are building these mold-free houses. No, right?
It'd be nice.
It'd be nice. It'd be nice. It's kind of almost the opposite in many cases.
Right. Right.
Um, so staying is always going to be a bit easier to being successful at eliminating sources, right? And making sure you're getting to as much as possible. So here you're going to do it all. Identify the sources. How is it dispersing? What are the biotoxins? What are my exposure in the house? Okay. Any questions on that one, Kendra?
No,
Anything?
I
No?
love how you're giving a game plan, because here's the thing. When people reach out, they go to Facebook groups or whoever they're contacting, they want to know, just tell me the plan. And I think the message here is there's no one right path or one single path. It's a little more complicated. It's dependent on a number of factors. And I love how you're breaking this down for
Mhm.
people to think about so that they can make their next steps, right? Because it's so individualized and
Mhm.
unique to your situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into the new home seeker, because this has become more demanding now than ever,
Mhm.
right? We obviously all know about the housing crisis. We obviously all know about um, the line of people that have been occurring at the door when buying a new house, and on the rental side, same thing is happening,
Mhm.
right? So I don't like this strategy that people are employing right now, where it's just, I'm going to ERMI every single home I walk into. What a waste of money. Why? Right? Let's use our eyes first.
Right. Right.
Let's just look. Let's look and see if it's even worth it. Because as we talked about, every home is going to have something. But before we invest dollars into a home that ultimately may, if we just look around and find, I don't know, 10 problems, we know that that's too much for us to take a look at. We're opening up sink and there's water damage under every sink. Like, do you really want to go through and pay $300-400 to have an ERMI done? No.
Mhm.
Right. So first, phase one, of this seeking process, go through and look around. Okay. If it's looking good and you're only seeing a few issues, next step in that process is going to be understanding the load within the environment. What's there? Are we seeing really bad molds? Did these people prep this so well that it's painted over everything and there's actually a bigger problem here that we can't see? Right. So running MSQ PCR or Hermes, looking at the toxic load in the environment. And then finally, if that comes back looking okay, and it's at a level that we're feeling comfortable with, that's when you want to do more of the source driven testing, right? And little secret here,
Oh, I
right?
love
On Okay, a little secret on the disclosures in the disclosure states. When you do this source testing, right? Now they need to disclose that or disprove it.
Mm,
Okay.
wow.
So if you test and you find a mold problem and you're looking to buy, you've now just created a negotiating tool for yourself, right? You can go back and say, hey guys, look, ran all this testing, found 7 sources. You can have a remediation contractor come in and look at the place and give a bid, and then be able to go back and say, this is going to cost $40,000 to fix. Let's talk about price again
Mm-hmm.
here,
Mm-hmm.
right? By the time you're at this level of doing sources, you really want to be in the phase of where you're really serious about moving forward. Now that's if you're buying. If you're renting, you're going to have less wiggle room
Right.
here. Okay. So on the rental side, what we're looking for more of is your landlord willing to play ball here? Like if you brought these things up, are they going to be like, oh, whatever needs to be done, just let us know, we will handle it? Or are they going to say to you, nah, it's no problem, don't worry about it, I'll send somebody to paint it, whatever, and
Oh,
they're
yeah.
minimizing, right? You don't want that. You don't want that. So we're protecting resource by phasing in, we're saving money, we're making sure we're not just going full board when we walk in, and knowing everything will have some degree of mold and feeling acceptable with that at points through this process. So you're prepared. You're not just blindsided. You found a house that you love, you want it, and then there's mold all over the place, and you just sunk a few $1,000s into finding this problem out. Okay.
Yeah, and I love that. And start with what's free, your eyes. We have some resources on the 5 signs of hidden mold, what those look like. You can tell a lot by, don't look at the pretty fixtures or the kitchen. Look up, look down, look at the baseboards, look under the sinks. You can tell a lot if you start looking in the right places.
Yeah, it's all smoke and mirrors on
Yeah.
sales transactions and rentals, right? So, like you said, look for the areas where just open up sink cabinets, look around, download the guide that Kendra's talking about. So, I want to touch on this, and then we can wrap. But the litigation and insurance side is a very hot topic. I could probably do 30 minutes on this on its own, but
Maybe we can do a follow-up podcast on this.
yeah, we should. So when you talk about insurance and litigation, they're so similar because you actually have to prove where it's coming from. Okay. We talked about the litigation a little bit on the rental side. You have to show where the source is. Okay. We have this kind of 3-phase process we call cause, effect, effect. The first, the cause. Where is it? What caused the problem? With insurance, it's always about water, right? It has to be some sort of sudden and accidental water event that allowed mold to grow to begin with. Okay. And that could be like a pipe burst or a dishwasher failure, something like that. Then what we need to do is show how the dishwasher that failed and flooded the kitchen disperse those spores to the other side of the house, and that you need a whole home cleaning. Now, here's the thing. Unfortunately, insurance companies just do not care about the health impact. From our perspective, you want to know as an individual that if there are mycotoxins there, right? Or if there are endotoxins within the environment, are they going to chip in extra money on this from an insurance perspective? Typically, we see no. But it does point and help to understand that from a cleanup side of things. It's not like if you got a letter from your doctor and showed that it's in your body and it's in your home, the insurance adjuster is going to care any more about it. He's got a job to do. It's a contract. It says X, Y, and Z. This is what we'll cover. So it's kind of an optionality there. And the litigation side, of course, as we talked about before, you have to prove the whole thing out, right? Whether you're going after neglect or you purchased a home and someone lied and whatever, right? You need to show cause, effect, right? How the sources of the problems are there, they're cross-contaminating the home, how it's impacting the body. Because you could do a mycotoxin test in the house and then test your body for mycotoxins, right? Some people don't know that. So there's a tie there that can be linked back. So you really want to develop that plan of action, laying that cookie trail out for the people to understand the full thing. So those are the 4, I'd say, main profiles and how they're broken out. I really hope that this kind of helps people understand how to approach their individual situations.
No, thank you. This is, people talk about wanting a roadmap, and this is the closest I've ever seen to a roadmap. The steps, the reasoning behind, understanding that testing strategic and should be done with purpose. It should influence your next steps and answer a question you have. And so this is wonderful. And we're definitely going to have to follow up on this insurance piece in another episode. But thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to leave us with any parting thoughts or other tips before we wrap things up?
I have a little tagline I'm trying to catch on here.
Oh, okay, let's hear it.
Okay. If you smell something musty, make sure you call somebody trusty, a certified fun guy.
That's funny.
It's
like it.
Something.
It's a dad joke. I can tell you have a kid. I love it.
Yeah, I'm testing it out. It doesn't usually land, but thank you for laughing. I appreciate it.
No problem. I love it. I love mold jokes. I love all things mold and water damage related. I'm a big nerd. But for anyone listening, if you want more great information like this, please go to changetheairfoundation.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Sometimes there are exclusive things that go out through the newsletter. It's the best way to keep in touch. When we have great interviews like this, we push them out through the newsletter. There's also tons of articles and other interviews that you can find. So definitely check out changetheairfoundation.org, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much.